Every historian has a dream. Ours, at least mine, isn't about money or fame. It's about discovery. It's the fantasy of finding in a dusty basement a forgotten box of documents that changes everything we thought we knew about the past. The chance to find the truth, the raw, unfiltered truth behind the myths. My name is Peter, and I am a historian, and I managed to live that dream. I was given total access to the secrets of the Redfield family, the richest and most powerful dynasty in the country. I read the diaries, the letters, the documents that no one had ever seen, and my job was not to reveal the truth I found. It was to bury it forever under a mountain of gold and very well-written lies. My story began 2 years ago. I was an academic, a smart guy with a PhD, but who in practice lived off research grants and poorly paid classes at a second-rate university. I was passionate about our country's economic history, especially the rise of the great industrial barons of the 20th century. And there was no baron greater, no myth more powerful than that of the late Arthur Redfield. Any schoolchild knew his story. It was our country's official capitalist fairy tale. The poor boy, the son of immigrants, who started by selling screws on the street and, with unparalleled genius and relentless work, built an industrial empire that now spans continents. The perfect self-made man, a national hero, the author of his own story. I had already written a few academic articles about him, always lamenting the lack of access to primary sources. His story was told only through authorized biographies and fawning news reports, until one day the phone rang. It was the Redfield Foundation, the family's philanthropic organization. They had read my articles, and they had a proposal for me. The matriarch of the family, Arthur's widow, Mrs. Beatrice Redfield, wanted to commission the definitive biography of her late husband, a book that would be the reference work for future generations, and they wanted me to write it. The meeting was at the family mansion, a palace in the capital's most exclusive neighborhood, occupying an entire city block. It was a place that didn't scream new money. It whispered old power. I was received by Beatrice Redfield in person, an 80-year-old woman with the posture of a queen and eyes of cutting intelligence. "Mr. Peter," she said, her voice firm, "I've read your work. You are a serious historian, and that is what I want. I don't want another book of empty praise. I want an honest biography, one that shows the man behind the myth, his genius, yes, but also his strength, his toughness, the difficult decisions he had to make to build this country." The language was carefully chosen. Difficult decisions. I knew what that meant. It was a euphemism for the skeletons in the closet. "To do this work," she continued, "you will need access, unrestricted access, and that is what I am offering you." And then she made me the offer that would make any historian in the world sell their soul. "I will open my husband's personal archive to you, his diaries from his adolescence, the letters he exchanged with partners, friends, and enemies, the first drafts of his business plans, documents that no other researcher has ever seen. You will have the truth in your hands. And of course, there was the salary, a sum that would solve my financial life forever." I accepted. I accepted on the spot, blinded by academic ambition, by the chance to be the man who would tell the true story of Arthur Redfield. The following week, I settled into the guest wing of the mansion and began my work in the archive. It was a private, climate-controlled library with the smell of old paper and leather. It felt like paradise. The housekeeper brought me boxes and more boxes of documents, leather-bound diaries, bundles of letters tied with ribbon. I decided to start at the beginning, with Arthur Redfield's first diary. I opened it with almost religious care. The cover was dark leather with the initials AR embossed in gold. The first page was dated from when he was 17. I expected to read about hardship, about poverty, about the dreams of a humble boy, the first line of the self-made man myth. But the first sentence I read was not about hunger or hard work. It was, "My father is an idiot. He refuses to give me the money to buy the sports car I want. Says I need to learn the value of work. What a hypocrite. He's never worked a day in his life, just managed the fortune his own father left him. I stopped and read it again. Father? Fortune? Sports car? I continued reading, my confusion growing with every page. The diary entries of the young Arthur were not about the struggle to survive. They were about complaining that his allowance was smaller than his older brother's, Francis. They were about fights to decide which of the two brothers would use the family's summer house for the holiday. They were about the anger he felt toward his father for favoring his older brother in the family business. Family business? The diary continued, and the pieces of a puzzle I didn't know existed began to form. The Redfield family was not a family of poor immigrants. They were already rich, very rich, owners of one of the largest import-export companies in the country, inherited from the grandfather. The myth, the story we all learned in school, the poor boy who sold screws on the street, was a lie, a complete lie. I sat there in that silent room, the diary open in my lap. The smell of old paper now seemed to me the smell of a farce. The biography of the country's greatest self-made man began with him at 17, complaining that the family driver had scratched the fender of his father's luxury car. On the first page of the first document, I did not find the story of a poor visionary. I found the story of a rich, spoiled boy, full of anger toward his older brother. And I realized with a chill that ran down my spine that the story I was hired to tell already began with a monumental lie, and my job, I was beginning to understand, was not to discover the truth. It was to make sure no one else ever discovered it. I spent the rest of that first day in a state of shock and intellectual excitement. The story I knew was a lie. That was a fact, and for a historian, discovering a lie of this magnitude is like finding gold. My mind started working, formulating a new thesis. Okay, Arthur Redfield was not a self-made man. He was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, but that, in a way, made his story even more impressive. He didn't create an empire from scratch. He seized it. He was the younger son, the rebel, who outmaneuvered his heir, older brother, and transformed the family's prosperous company into a global powerhouse. The story wasn't about a David versus Goliath. It was about a Cain versus Abel in the business world, a story of betrayal, of ambition, a Shakespearean tragedy. And that was much more interesting. With this new theory in mind, my research focus shifted. I put the personal diaries aside and dove into the Redfield family's business archives, into the documents from the 40s and 50s, when the company's great transformation took place. And the evidence I found seemed to confirm my new thesis in a brutal way. I found the minutes from the board meetings of Redfield and Sons Imports, and it was a family horror show. The father, the original patriarch, was a conservative. He wanted to keep the business as it had always been. The older son, Francis, the heir apparent, followed his father's line. He was cautious. He valued tradition. And then there was Arthur. His interventions in the minutes were like grenades. He was aggressive, visionary, and openly disdained the caution of his brother and father. He proposed hostile takeovers, high-risk investments, entry into new and volatile markets. In almost every vote, his proposals were defeated 2-1, but Arthur was not the type to accept defeat. In the archives, I discovered the creation of a second company, a small consultancy he had opened in secret, and through this company, he began his private war. He used the money from his share of the inheritance to secretly buy shares in competing companies and suppliers of the family's own firm, creating chaos in the market that forced his father and brother to make decisions that benefited him. It was a brilliant and merciless game of chess. He was playing against his own family. His brother, Francis, in the letters he exchanged with his father, seemed like a tragic figure. He complained about Arthur's aggressiveness and lack of scruples. "Father," he wrote in a 1952 letter, Arthur doesn't play by the rules. He doesn't want to compete. He wants to destroy, and I fear he will destroy us in the process. Francis was the good man, the honorable man, and in the history of capitalism, good men are often just the first obstacle to be removed. Gradually, the image I had of Arthur solidified. He was a genius, yes, but an evil genius, a corporate predator who used guerrilla tactics to get what he wanted. And then I found the folder that changed everything again. It was a dark leather folder with no label. Inside were dozens of files, most with black censorship bars, probably made by the family itself years later. They were about his acquisitions in the 60s, the era when Redfield became a monopoly. They were dossiers, detailed dossiers on his biggest competitors, information about their finances, their weaknesses, and most frighteningly, about the personal lives of their presidents. Extramarital affairs, gambling debts, family secrets. Arthur didn't just analyze his rivals, he dissected them, looking for the jugular. And one by one, these rivals fell. A large steel company whose president was caught in an adultery scandal saw its shares plummet and was bought by Redfield for a fraction of its value. A logistics company, which was the biggest thorn in Arthur's side, suddenly found itself the target of a violent and mysterious union strike that led it to bankruptcy. Redfield, of course, bought its assets at auction. I was reading the story of a mobster, a man who did not hesitate to use blackmail, sabotage, and espionage to achieve his goals. I was shocked, but also fascinated. This was the story of the century, the true face of the national hero. And at the bottom of the folder, I found the definitive proof, the smoking gun. It was a subfolder, with a single date as its title. Inside was a series of copies of telexes, the secure communication method of the time, exchanged between Arthur and a man identified only as the consultant. The messages were about the last major competitor remaining, a chemical plant that refused to be sold. The messages were short in code, but the meaning was clear. Arthur, the problem in their production sector continues to be an obstacle. The consultant, problems can be solved. The question is how permanent the solution needs to be. Arthur, the solution needs to be definitive. The consultant, understood. The failure in the main machinery is scheduled. There will be noise. Arthur, I don't care about the noise, only the silence that will come after. 2 weeks after the date of those messages, the competitor's factory exploded. A catastrophic fire attributed at the time to an accidental gas leak. The accident killed 3 workers. The company went bankrupt. And 6 months later, Redfield bought the land and the product patents for a paltry sum. I felt a chill run through my body. This was no longer about business. It was about human lives. And at the bottom of the folder, there was one last document, a copy of a payment receipt, a payment of a hefty sum coming from Arthur's personal account to the consultant's company. And on the memo line, a single word, solution. I closed the folder, my hands sweating. I had found it, the proof, the direct link between Arthur Redfield and the deaths of 3 men. He wasn't just a ruthless businessman, he was a criminal, a saboteur, and most likely a murderer. I finally understood my real job. The matriarch, Mrs. Beatrice, didn't want me to write an honest biography. She wanted me to take all this filth, all this violence, all this blood, and turn it into gold. I wasn't a biographer. I was an undertaker, hired to bury the bodies the national hero had left in his wake. And my work was just beginning. I spent the following weeks immersed in that dark leather folder. Every document was a confirmation of my theory. Arthur Redfield was a shark, a man who built his empire on the wreckage of his enemies. The story was clear, brutal, and for a biographer fascinating. My job now was that of an alchemist. I needed to turn mud into gold, to take the raw facts of blackmail and sabotage and rewrite them in the language of power and genius. I began to draft the first chapters of the biography. the hostile takeover of a family company, became a visionary market maneuver that anticipated industry trends. The mysterious strike that broke a competitor became an example of the old guard's inability to adapt to new times, making way for Redfield's leadership. I was getting good at it. I was learning to speak the family's language, the language of power, where crimes are never called by their true names. I was building my version of the myth, feeling like a clever accomplice, a manipulator of history. I thought I had control of the narrative, but the story, the real story, began to leak through the cracks of the very documents I was studying. The first problem I found was with the chronology. In trying to assemble a precise timeline of Arthur's rise, I came across long periods of silence. It was precisely at the most critical moments, in the weeks leading up to his most brilliant and aggressive moves, that his personal diaries became strangely empty. For example, in the month of the Great Fire at the competing factory, the pages of Arthur's diary contained no notes on business, no strategy, no mention of the consultant. Instead, they were filled with melancholy poems, detailed descriptions of the shape of clouds, and philosophical reflections on mortality. It was the diary of a depressed poet, not a corporate gangster orchestrating an attack. At first, I tried to rationalize. Okay, I thought, he was a complex man, compartmentalized. He used poetry as an escape from the brutality of his own actions. Or, a more cynical theory, he was deliberately creating an alibi in his own diaries, a criminal mastermind thinking of every detail. I clung to this second explanation. It fit my image of Arthur as a master manipulator. But the next inconsistency was harder to ignore. To fill the gaps left by Arthur's diaries, I began to read the correspondence of his older brother, Francis, the good son, the heir who was defeated. I expected to find the letters of a weak, frightened man, complaining about his brother's aggression, but what I found was the opposite. Precisely in the periods when Arthur was silent, Francis's letters to the company's lawyers and managers were of a clarity and strategic genius that left me stunned. It was Francis who detailed the steps for the acquisition of the steel company. It was he who gave the orders to pressure the suppliers. It was he who seemed to be in absolute command of the operation. I had before me two narratives that didn't add up. On one side, Arthur, the supposed evil genius, writing about the sadness of autumn rains. On the other, Francis, the supposed weak heir, acting like a ruthless general on the business battlefield. My gangster theory started to fall apart. It didn't make sense. Why would Arthur pay for a solution to a problem that on paper was being brilliantly solved by his brother? Why would the mastermind behind it all fall silent at the most crucial moments? I was lost. The story had a hole in the middle of it, a man-sized hole. I needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to me, the matriarch, Mrs. Beatrice. I scheduled a meeting with her under the pretext of needing to clarify some chronological details to ensure the biography's accuracy. She received me in her private library, a different room from the archives, a more intimate place, with family portraits on the walls. I was direct but careful. Mrs. Redfield, I began, I'm having a little difficulty with the narrative of the 1960s. It's a period of incredible expansion for the company, but in analyzing the documents, your late husband's activity in his diaries decreases dramatically at these crucial moments. In contrast, the letters of his brother Francis show admirable leadership and strategic vision. It almost seems as if it was Francis and not Arthur who was the true architect behind those moves. I need to understand the dynamic between the two brothers to be able to describe your husband's genius with the fidelity he deserves. I expected her to lie, to create a story, to say that the brother was just executing Arthur's secret orders. But she didn't. She looked at me for a long moment. A heavy silence filled the room, and I saw something in her face that I had never seen before, a crack in her Ice Queen facade. And what leaked through that crack was a sadness so old and so deep, it seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime. She sighed, a tired sound that seemed to come from another century. And then she said the words that changed everything once again. "Peter," she began, her voice low, almost a whisper. "You are a good historian, too smart for your own good. I hired you to write a legend, but I see you can't help but search for the truth." She paused and faced me, her eyes filled with a pain I didn't understand. "I see I can no longer hide it from you. My husband's secret, Peter. The real burden he carried his entire life. It wasn't the crimes he committed. It was the battles he couldn't fight." Mrs. Beatrice's words echoed in the silent library. The real burden he carried wasn't the crimes he committed. It was the battles he couldn't fight. I stared at her, confused. "I don't understand. The documents, the hostile takeovers, the factory sabotage." "Exactly," she cut me off, her voice firm but with an undercurrent of sadness. "The most brilliant plays, the most ruthless, the most decisive for the growth of the Redfield Empire. Look at my husband's diaries again, Peter. Look at the dates. Where was he when these things happened?" I thought about the diaries, the blank pages, the melancholy poems. "He was absent," I replied. "Exactly," she said. "Absent, that's the word. Arthur, my husband, the great national hero, was a sick man, very sick." She got up and walked to the window, looking out at the mansion's gardens. "The myth you read in books, that of the poor boy, was an invention, a lie we created to protect a much deeper secret. Arthur was born with a silver spoon, yes, but he was also born with a darkness in his mind, what doctors today call severe bipolar disorder, with long episodes of psychotic depression. Back then, they just called it madness. The revelation hit me like a wave. There were two Arthurs," she continued, her voice low. "There was the manic Arthur, full of limitless energy, grandiose and reckless ideas. And there was the depressive Arthur. And that one spent the most time with us. For months, sometimes for years on end, he would lock himself in his room, unable to see the light of day, unable to speak, lost in a labyrinth of melancholy from which no one could pull him out." She turned to me. "The poems you read in his diaries, they weren't the escape of a criminal genius. They were the only whispers that could escape from his inner prison." I was shocked. The mobster theory, which had seemed so solid, was dissolving before my eyes. "But what about the company, the decisions, the deals that were closed in those periods?" "Ah," she said with a sad smile, "that's where the other part of our secret comes in, our forgotten hero." She led me to a large oil portrait that hung in a dark corner of the library. The painting showed two young men. One was Arthur, with his intense, charismatic gaze. The other was taller, more serious, with a kind and intelligent look. "The older brother, Francis," she said, "my brother-in-law, the true business genius of the Redfield family." And then she told me the real story. Francis was the heir, the brain, the administrator, but he loved his younger brother above all else. And when Arthur's illness became debilitating, he made a decision to protect the brother he loved and the family name from the devastating stigma of mental illness, which at the time would destroy any business. Francis made a sacrifice. He began to rule the empire from the shadows. In the long periods when Arthur was absent, Beatrice explained, it was Francis who made all the decisions. It was he who orchestrated the acquisitions, who negotiated with competitors, who had the strategic vision. He used Arthur's name, signed documents as his brother's proxy. He was the brain. Arthur was just the face, the facade, in his brief periods of stability. I thought of the letters, the detailed plans I had read, signed by Francis. It all began to make sense. "And the factory fire?" I asked. "The payment for the solution?" Beatrice laughed, a joyless laugh. "The solution," Francis found, was to buy the competing company for double its market value, including a lifetime pension for the families of the workers who died in what was, in fact, a tragic accident. He didn't destroy the competitor. He saved it from bankruptcy and took on its debts. But for the public and the other shareholders, the story needed to be one of the ruthless victory of the genius Arthur Redfield. I sat down, feeling the weight of that revelation. My work, my book, was a far more complex farce than I had imagined. I wasn't hired to hide the crimes of a villain. I was hired to erase the existence of a hero. My job was to take all the genius, all the honor, and all the hard work of Francis and attribute it to Arthur, the sick man who spent his days writing poetry while his brother built an empire in his name. All to keep the myth of the great man alive, to protect the family from the shame of having a mentally ill patriarch. Beatrice seemed to read my mind. She walked to a locked cabinet in the corner of the library and opened it. Inside, there were no books. There were more folders, dozens of them. These, she said, are Francis's diaries, the real business records, the strategies, the confessions, the true history of the Redfield Empire. She looked at me, her eyes now pleading, but with the firmness of a queen. Your job, Peter, is to take the genius that is in these documents and put it in my husband's biography. Francis understood and accepted his sacrifice. He died 10 years ago, knowing his name would be forgotten by history. Now, the responsibility of ensuring that Arthur's legacy remains intact, that my brother-in-law's sacrifice was not in vain, is yours. She approached and placed a small velvet box on the table in front of me, a heavy, ornate box. And to begin, she said, this is the first thing you need to make disappear from history. With trembling hands, I opened the box. Inside, there was no document. There was a medal of solid gold. It was the highest honor in national industry, awarded by the government decades ago, and the name engraved on it, in elegant letters, was not Arthur Redfield. It was Francis Redfield. It was the only public recognition the true genius of the family ever received, an award that was quickly hushed up, bought off, and buried in the family archives. I picked up the medal. The metal was cold and heavy with the weight of a lifetime of sacrifice and a historical lie. And I understood my first task as the official biographer of the Redfield family. I didn't have to write history, I had to destroy it, starting by erasing its one and only true hero. I stood there in the silence of that library, holding the solid gold medal. The weight of the object in my hand felt like the weight of history itself, a history I was being paid to erase. My historian's conscience screamed. This was a crime against the truth. My duty was to take those documents, that proof of Francis's sacrifice and genius, and show it to the world. But my ambition and a dose of fear whispered something else. If I refused, I would be fired, silenced. I would return to my life of academic obscurity, forever haunted by the story I could have written. If I accepted, I would become the definitive biographer of our country's greatest icon. My name would be in every bookstore. My career would be made. The price was just one forgotten hero. And so, I made my choice. I rationalized, as intellectuals do so well. History is written by the victors, I told myself. Arthur Redfield won. His legacy is what matters to the country. Francis's sacrifice in the end served a greater purpose, keeping the myth intact. It was a flimsy excuse for my own cowardice and ambition. I began my work, and what a strange and perverse work it was. I spent my days reading Francis's diaries. They were fascinating. The mind of that man was a labyrinth of brilliant strategies, of a deep understanding of markets and human nature. He was the true genius. Then I would take his genius and translate it. I would rewrite his strategies, his decisions, but in Arthur's voice and style. I used the fragments of poetry and melancholy from Arthur's diaries to give a touch of the tormented genius to his brother's business maneuvers. I was creating a character, a corporate Frankenstein, a hero who never existed, stitched together from the pieces of two broken brothers. Mrs. Beatrice would read my drafts and approve with a satisfied nod. She saw her husband's legend being solidified, immortalized by my pen, And I felt more and more like an imposter. I was nearing the end of my research, focusing now on the last years of the two brothers' lives. I had almost the entire story assembled. The story of Arthur's illness and Francis's sacrifice. I thought I had seen the bottom of that family secret. But as any good historian knows, there is always one more document, one more dusty box in the basement. It was in one of those boxes, containing Francis's personal files from the year he died, that I found the final anomaly. I had always been told that Francis had died of a massive heart attack in his sleep. That was the official story. But in reading his personal diary from that final year, I noticed a change in tone. Francis, who had always written about his brother with a protective love, began to write with a growing bitterness, a resentment. "He's getting better," Francis wrote. "Arthur's periods of lucidity are longer, and in these periods he is cruel. He mocks my work. He treats me like an employee. I think he's forgotten that I was the one who saved this company, that I was the one who saved him." Their relationship was deteriorating. And then I found a folder labeled Legal Correspondence Confidential. They were copies of letters exchanged between Francis and his personal lawyer. And what I read in those letters turned my blood cold for the third time in that house. Francis was not going to live in the shadows forever. He was tired of the sacrifice. In the letters, he detailed his plan to his lawyer. As soon as Arthur died, he, Francis, would reveal the truth. He was preparing documents, evidence, a memoir. He was going to claim his rightful place in the history of the empire he built. The last letter to the lawyer was dated 2 weeks before his sudden death. In it, he said, "I have informed Beatrice of my intentions. She needs to prepare for the truth. The era of the Arthur Redfield myth is coming to an end." I stared at that sentence, my heart pounding uncontrollably. And then, at the bottom of the folder, there was one last document. One that shouldn't have been there. It was a copy of a payment statement, a payment of a hefty sum, coming from Mrs. Beatrice's personal account to the company of the same consultant that Arthur had used years before to solve the factory problem. The date of the payment was the day after Francis's death, and on the memo line it was written, "For the Eternal Rest Service." An eternal rest. The final, darkest truth of all hit me like a lightning bolt. Beatrice, the matriarch, the grieving widow, the woman who hired me to honor her husband's legacy. She wasn't the guardian of a tragic secret. She was its architect. She couldn't allow Francis to reveal the truth, not because of Arthur's honor, but because of power. If the world knew that Francis was the true genius, the inheritance would be disputed. The control of the empire, which was in her hands and the hands of her children with Arthur, would be threatened. She didn't protect her husband. She protected herself and her bloodline, and to do so, she silenced the only man who could challenge her, the brother who had saved her family. The story Beatrice told me was a lie, yes, but it was the most genius lie of all. It was a lie within a lie. She didn't hire me to hide her husband's illness. She hired me to hide her own murder. And the proof of her complicity was now in my hands, and I was her official biographer. The man tasked with painting her portrait as a noble and devoted widow for posterity. I finished the book. I spent the next 6 months writing the greatest work of fiction of my career, the biography of Arthur Redfield. The book was brilliant, moving, inspiring. I took Francis's genius and dressed it in Arthur's melancholy, creating a complex, tormented hero that the public would love. And I erased Francis. I erased the illness. And most importantly, I erased Mrs. Beatrice's Eternal Rest Service. The book was released, and as expected, it was a thunderous success, an instant bestseller. The critics hailed me as one of the greatest historians of my generation. The Redfield family paid me a fortune. Beatrice thanked me in public, with tears in her eyes, for having captured the true essence of her beloved Arthur. I had made it. I had fame, money, prestige, and my soul was dirtier than the secret I had helped to bury. I lived with it for a year, A year of sleepless nights, of a success that tasted like ashes. I had my reward, but Beatrice had her impunity, and Francis's story remained dead, until I decided it was time to do my real job as a historian. A historian's revenge is not with a weapon, it's with the truth. During my year at the mansion, I didn't just read the documents, I digitized them, every page, every diary, every letter, every receipt, including the one for the eternal rest. I had my own secret archive, stored on an encrypted server. A year after the launch of my best-selling book, I made my final move. A major international university announced the creation of the Francis Redfield Digital Archive, an online collection with free public access. The archive contained all the documents I had digitized, the real story in its entirety. And, as an introduction to the archive, there was a document signed and authenticated by me, a confession. In the confession, I detailed the entire process, my hiring, the lie about the illness, the discovery of the murder, and my complicity in the creation of the fraudulent biography. I explained that the book I wrote was the greatest proof of the farce, and that this digital archive was my penance and the true biography. I also announced that I had created an insurance policy. Copies of that archive had been sent to the world's biggest newspapers, programmed to be published automatically if anything accidental happened to me. The scandal was biblical. The Redfield family's reputation imploded. The legend of the national hero turned to dust, and Mrs. Beatrice, the Ice Queen, found herself at the center of a murder investigation. Me, I lost everything. My academic career, my reputation. I had to leave the country. Today, I live under a false name in a small town far from everything. Sometimes I visit the Digital Archive's website, and I see the comments from students, from other historians, from ordinary people, finally discovering the story of the forgotten genius, Francis Redfield, the hero who was erased. Beatrice Redfield hired me to be an undertaker, and I did my job. I buried her story under a mountain of lies. But a good historian knows that the truth never really dies. It just lies dormant, waiting for someone with the courage to dig. She paid me to write a book, and I wrote it. But what she didn't understand is that the biography I published wasn't the end of my work. It was just the preface, the real story, mine. I published a year later, and unlike hers, mine was not for sale. All right, it's that time. If this story has you hooked, let's do the full ritual. Hit the like button to support the channel, subscribe so you don't miss a beat, and ring that bell to be the first to know what's coming. Your opinion is golden, so drop it in the comments below.